Hi, hello. Welcome to our Meetup.net meetups for September 2023. It's a hybrid meetup. We have some people joined in StreamYard. Have we done that? And yeah, it's and we're here in the office of Luminary, who have invited us. Welcome, everybody. We are holding this meeting in Melbourne, Naarm, on Wurundjeri land. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and we are excited to be here. So, welcome, everybody. You might have noticed I'm Barbara, and LinkedIn, I'm Barbara Marin Winkler-Wolf. And GitHub, I am BBMM Code Girl, and my motto is code, run, so repeat. And so we have been allowed to host this meetup at Luminary. Marty has allowed us into this lovely space. Big shout out to him, and big shout out to Six Pivot, who have been so generous to keep us fed and have sponsored the pizza tonight. So in general, we have a code of conduct. We want to try and be courteous to each other and do the usual politeness, being governed by the usual politeness. If you want to look it up, there's the URL of the actual code of conduct of the .NET Foundation. Everybody who's here has already found out. So the pizza is out there, the drinks are out there, the toilets are out the door and around the corner to the right, very much the right, and then through the alley. We are streaming this meeting live on YouTube. If you don't want to be recorded, maybe stay silent, maybe stay behind the camera. If you have questions, raise your hand, and if online, you can obviously make comments. Is that correct, Bill? Yeah. And after the presentation, there will also be a Q&A session if you haven't been able to ask in between. What's your, Glenn, what's your take on questions during the presentation or after?
Just ask this one.
Oh, fine. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll just come up on here.
Yeah, so this is an appeal. We need you. Thanks for everybody for joining. We need everybody to help us. We need people to help us organize the meeting, getting ideas, setting up, finding locations, finding food. And if you have a talk you can give, or you know somebody who has a cool talk in the area of .NET, or just better working as a software engineer, or you general ideas of how the world works, yes, please submit a talk if you can. We are on YouTube. This is the link to our YouTube channel. You would already be connected. We are trying to really keep up with posting all the meetups on YouTube. It doesn't always work, but this one definitely is there because we're streaming it directly. As they say, we have swag. So you can have your own Melt.net t-shirt if you want. If you've seen William, who has just disappeared, he, for example, has one of these t-shirts. Obviously, this is a Redbubble link. So it's in the USA, and you order something there, and then it takes a long time to get there. So right now, we're working on something else. Maybe you see what I've got here. So I have a slightly different logo, and I have it with my own name. And so watch the space. Maybe we get this done for more people if people want it. But that's a project that we're working on. Then also, don't know how many of you have been involved in the DDD. developer, a conference around the world by developers, for developers, with developers, and it hasn't been in Melbourne for the last 5 years. It got knocked out by COVID, and it's the first time there will be a new one, and they now have a date. It's 16th March of 2024 and will be in the Melbourne Town Hall. Do sign up, do get involved. So obviously, we are understanding ourselves to also be a forum for employers who sponsor us to advertise positions, or to, if you are looking for work, this is a place to post that. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to say here. So 6 people for looking. Anybody right now? No. Okay. And unfortunately, Marty isn't here. Could tell us something about Luminary. My special thanks go to William and Bill, who have helped me set this up. So William, like, I'm talking through a microphone right now that William has done that, and the camera over there is his. And Bill is here doing the YouTube streaming. Thanks very much to you both. Yeah, and we will have this lovely talk about open source in the .NET space today, and the ins and outs, and how it compares to the open source in other frameworks by Glenn. Yeah, please, Glenn, take it away.
So let me just put Glenn on this mic. Screen here, so go ahead. Share your screen onto there. Share your screen on StreamYard too. Yep. Okay, I added that to the stream. Yep, you're good. Oh, did you give him the microphone?
You put it on there. How does it?
Thank you.
Probably on stream on it. Seeing that, we see.
Seeing that.
Hey, Glenn. All right. Can you just put that in your pocket or just click onto something there? Okay. Click onto here something there.
No?
There we go.
Can everyone hear me? Yep, can you hear me? Cool. We're live. So I'm going to talk about open source sustainability, which has been a hot topic online. A couple of incidents has happened in the .NET community recently that's promoted, kind of like highlighted the fact that maybe open source development in the .NET world isn't as sustainable as other areas like JavaScript and other frameworks. So I want to highlight some of those. And also, I've recently become a board member of the .NET Foundation. I want to kind of like just discuss that kind of thing as well. So my background, I'm a Microsoft MVP since 2019. Was nominated because I did a lot of work on a framework called Reactive UI, which is a kind of like a MVVM framework for UI, a whole heap of different UI technologies, Xamarin, Maui now, WPF, WinForms. Most of the .NET Foundation supported UI frameworks, basically Reactive UI as a front end for it, and it connects up with the reactive framework, which is kind of like link for events. So you have a streaming events coming in, you want to mutate that event, they become first-class citizens inside of .NET that allows you to interact with them like you would with Link. Back in August, I became a .NET Foundation board member. So I'll discuss a little bit later about what the .NET Foundation is. And I've been actively contributing, I guess, to open source before 2018, but took over Reactive UI in 2018. I also worked in Seattle for both Microsoft and Amazon. Worked for the big boys, and also have a background in games technology. So I worked for 2K Games in San Francisco area, a lot of game studios here in Australia. Interestingly, some of the people here have a background and knew me from that world. So here in person, so that was quite interesting here. So let's talk about the mission of the .NET Foundation. So its main mission is to nurture open source software for the .NET ecosystem. So originally it was kind of established for when they decided to make .NET itself open source. So they didn't want to have it connected directly with the Microsoft. So they made an external non-profit organization to foster open source in the .NET community in general. So a lot of frustration from the board's point of view is a lot of people see that the .NET Foundation is Microsoft. No, it's an external company where to try and promote disconnection from the Microsoft agenda, they created a foundation. But part of that is they do a lot of outreach as well. So they run a conference every year to discuss .NET in general, the .NET Conf. They'll kind of they have a number of projects underneath them that are sanctioned projects, as you would put it. They do a lot of education projects, so sort of reaching out to universities. They're expanding soon to universities outside of the US, so they want to target Canada, UK, Australia, to try and get more people involved in the .NET through education in general. So they're kind of trying to, nurture the .NET ecosystem in general. But today I'm going to focus more on the .NET Foundation's focused in regards to the projects, so maintainers, rather than the outreach or the education or those sort of projects. So one thing that the .NET Foundation does is it has a kind of a group of member projects, and the member projects get some limited benefits. So one big benefit is they get recognized by the foundation as being a sanctioned project, which is quite significant because we have quite a bit of validity checking and validation to make sure they're, they meet our criteria. So one of those is looking into active development. We want to see, they have multiple developers potentially, and, they're contributing to the community in general. We want to see that they have strong community support process in place. So being able to handle issues and seeing that they're responding to people, have they got a general community policy? Do they have a chat community? We also just look at, how many people are using it. We'll look at GitHub statistics, what projects are looking at are using this as a dependency, and also NuGet dependencies. So we'll look at number of downloads on NuGet. So we feel that the .NET Foundation, we play a vital role in evaluating these projects. Projects will submit themselves for evaluation. We'll go through the process. We have a project committee that meets once a month, and they will kind of go through each submission. They'll look at all that criteria, they'll look it up, and and now it's become a lot more Australian friendly times if you want to join in, because of me being a member, now the .NET board member. I was able to convince the people, hey, can you please not do this at 2 a.m. Australian time? So now at least it's a reasonable 7 a.m., which is for some people, probably not that reasonable, but at least you can get involved, you can discuss. And since then, we've had a few people that are well-known. Australia actually does have a lot of well-known .NET open source developers. So we've had a few of those people sign up to become part of the project committee, and just evaluating, the process. So recently we've started a project retirement strategy. So the idea is we've been pretty much come here, join us in our approach of gaining projects. We had some sort of criteria processes in place to make sure there's some basics in place, but now we're also looking at retirement from the foundation. The idea is we've had a few controversies over the years. Some of it produced by the foundation. Like I've been one of the people that have written articles about some of the strategies that the foundation's done that haven't been helpful. Like they attempted to do a very aggressive, you had to meet a criteria to remain on board, like basically an SLA equivalent. So I was very critical of that in the past. But at the same time, we don't want to have the risk of having a project that hasn't been run for, more than 18 months, and is going to have a risk for us in terms of doesn't have a security issue or things like that, or just it doesn't look great when a project hasn't been actively maintained. And at the moment, we're seeking feedback through a GitHub issue, and we've been advertising that a lot through the social media links like LinkedIn and X or Twitter. And we'd love for people to jump on that issue and provide feedback. We haven't got as many people as we'd like. It's quite a critical issue because we're effectively saying, hey, as part of this retirement, you're not going to get any support unless you reapply and found to be active again, for example. But that's not guaranteed. So we need a bit of sympathy around how to get that retirement process happening. So we'd love to have people's feedback on that. So now I'm going to talk about some of the big challenges that I've noticed in open source development with .NET. So the big one is funding. So in the other areas of other ecosystems with open source like JavaScript and stuff, you can quite easily, for the larger projects, get sponsorships, and they have tools like NPM Fund and tools like that. It's more easier, I should say, not super easy to get it. You can get good funding for sponsorships. But what's been happening is a lot of projects have been struggling with getting any money to survive. So one of the arguments with open source is you've got a license there, and the license is it's an MIT license for a lot of projects, or an Apache license. And hey, the license says, go ahead and download it, go ahead and use the product. There's no consequence as a corporate to consume these projects. And that's perfectly, if you take that argument, then projects like Mock use this license, and therefore you can use it. And that's the approach that a lot of large corporates in the .NET ecosystem has taken, right? They've taken the view that people have published these in NuGets, the license is correct, therefore we can make use of that project without any consequence. But at the end of the day, is people volunteering their time essentially at the back end, and they're doing it for a couple of different reasons, but they're making the product that these people can, these corporates consume, right? And one of the big things I found when I started contributing to open source is my skills dramatically increased, right? I learned a bunch of new techniques that I never learned otherwise. There's not too much stagnation in open source. If your normal day job is locked into this, a bit of an old way to thinking, because it doesn't make commercial sense to upgrade, you can get around that with with open source development. You can put a bit of effort in. And the other thing is a bit of a resume piece. you can use it for showing off to people. But a project called Mock had, if you look it up in NuGet, it's got millions of downloads. It's a mocking framework for making your tests easy. You can mock certain objects and the functionality of the objects. It's actually used inside Microsoft directly in the .NET code. They decided to create a framework for, they saw NPM fund, I guess, similar for basically highlighting to the corporates and users in general, hey, you probably should sponsor us. And the way they did that has caused a bit of controversy. So they had an Azure service. The Azure service they would scan through the Git repo that the person was working on, find the email addresses would hash them, and then send them up to the Azure service, and then check, hey, does this hash exist? Yes, no. If it doesn't, then produce a nag comment in the build, but also put a delay in, so the build would actually slow down if you had mock installed for the newer versions, and then the incentive for the mock developers was to go off and kind of like get people to kind of like join and sponsor the project. The issue is scraping Git history and emails and stuff can cause a bit of legal issues. If you're in Europe, you've got the strict European laws around gathering emails, especially the consent or no consent process involved, just going onto a NuGet, downloading a NuGet, and suddenly when you upgrade, you're suddenly getting your email sent across, which is not what people expected, right? So there was definitely a large controversy in terms of like that. But in general, the counter argument though is the mock guys had a sort of like a point, like in the .NET ecosystem, we don't really value the maintainer's time as much. Like reactive UI gets about $300 a month, for example, and there's other projects that have done deliberate promoting that have done a lot better. We just tend to kind of like keep the sponsorship open, and we have a couple of perks for people who've used, like we generally have. If you sponsor us for this amount of money, we'll offer you, a bit of tutoring whenever you need it within reason. But other projects have definitely made a bit more effort. So I can understand where Mike was coming from, but the implementation has got questions. But this caused a lot of maintainers, especially on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it now, like communicating, hey, we've definitely feel this pain as well. Like we're trying to maintain a project and we're just not getting any funding. And part of what I want to discuss today is the current strategies that people are using kind of adapt for that, right? So, so next slide. So these are the ones I've kind of seen people doing. So one that's getting a lot of popularity now, it's a bit new in the ecosystem, but they have a dual license. So they basically said, we like to develop open source software, but we can't really sponsor the large companies anymore. So we want to kind of like do a dual license. And what a dual license means is we'll keep the MIT license, but you can only use that MIT license version if you're under $1 million of gross revenue, for example. And if you're over $1 million, you need to purchase a subscription. And a lot of those dual licenses are based on the honor system, and these companies seem to be doing all right. So there's a company called Six Labors who are Australian-based. They create Image Sharp, which is one of the really good library for doing image manipulation. They've set up a website, really professional looking, makes it a little bit more of a nice deal for corporates to pick up. But the other thing about dual licensing is big corporates have a false incentive about if they get a sign into open source, the project might not be here next year, right? Like they have a view that open source means it's going away tomorrow. I'd rather pay, $1,000 a year for a subscription than, get the product for free and then I won't have any support, and what happens when the maintainer gets sick, and which is not necessarily, that's a false economy in a lot of the larger open source projects. Like, for example, Reactive UI, I'll use an example. There's 5 people maintaining it actively and making contributions, and if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, other people will take over. And we put in, part of the .NET Foundation's strategy when we come on board the project. They do have backup systems so that other people can take over. They have access to an admin account, which, to be fair though, they had some controversy misusing that in the past. So nowadays, a strict policy with the .NET Foundation, the admin accounts for emergencies only. It's not for everyday use. So this model of dual licensing appeals to a lot of those corporates because suddenly they have a bit of that support structure. Now now that project that was just relying on sponsorships and now have the ability to have a bit of money coming in. It appeals to the .NET market, which is mostly corporates, right? Well, like there's less hobbyist programmers in this realm, as much as the .NET Foundation wants to get those kids in from university. It's not what's there at the moment per se. So this model is great for that. Another great model is something I actually done is basically using the open source project as a kind of like a revenue piece for your company. So I sort of set up coming back in 2019 around Reactive UI. I would get companies through the the chat communities. People would be interested in contracting me for their services. I would I would develop a feature of Reactive UI. For example, we had a Prism layer that we integrated into Reactive UI that was funded by a company paying for my services and taking advantage of myself. And it allows you to have, the great thing about this model, it doesn't lock anyone out. So there's no cap of which the revenue caps out at, but you also are allowing the project to continue. And another advantage I found is you have alignment with what real world people need, rather than just making software for the software's sake. And also, it can promote a bit of community growth in my experience because the project grows in size. You have more money available. I have more time to commit to the project. When people see activity, they're more inclined to help you out. So suddenly you got the random people. Like a big thing for open source projects is Oktoberfest, when you suddenly get all the students coming in, which can be a good and a bad thing because there have been people trying to get that free T-shirt and just do a change a spelling mistake here or change one word and try to get the commit count up to get their free T-shirt. But having that, that graph of regular commits helps with, attracting people that like open source, because open source really is about, once you get into the grind, it's not that fun, but the fun part is just, being able to work on a feature and focusing on that feature and getting away from that corporate grind job, right? So that's where this model comes in. The next one we've already kind of discussed, which is the sponsorship model. So the challenge is attracting sponsors. As I said, the .NET ecosystem is really a corporate-based ecosystem. It's not necessarily the cool kid as much as we want it to be. We're doing a lot of work to make it that cool kid. There's a lot of really nice frameworks that come out in the last few years with .NET Core and .NET, minimal API stuff, and it's a lot easier to develop for. Functionally, C# is one of those great hybrid languages that's definitely, taken up functional programming a lot more, but allows you to go back to the classes you love. But it's hard to get those large corporates. But there's a lot of things that can help in this system, right? So one thing that's been discussed a lot in the community lately is there's a feature in GitHub called GitHub Sponsors, and GitHub Sponsors is a feature where individuals and corporations can pay for support. And one thing that's been discussed a lot in the community is maybe expanding GitHub sponsors. At the moment, you can set up your tiers and just basically text, and people can subscribe to those tiers. Another feature they've added just recently is private repos that only sponsors can access. So the idea of a private repo is that you can kind of like have those, like sponsors get private access to releases, private access to issues, can get priority support. You can kind of like say, if you sponsor us on the $15 level, for example, you'll get access to this repo or this account or whatever. You could even tier, right? You could have your VIP levels and your corporate sponsor levels, where you get different levels of support. But like it will involve basically GitHub sponsors expanding a lot. And I spoke to Martin Woodward, who's the VP of Git. Just sent him a message about a couple of weeks ago, kind of like saying, hey, it would be great to get some Patreon-like features into GitHub. And he was sort of like, yeah, we're bringing on some assets, some people on board to help out with that. But at the moment, we do have the private repos, and he linked me. You can definitely find a link to that on my Twitter X profile. But that's where like it's a definitely a harder approach to take, right? So I know people have attempted to kind of like use sponsors as a way to make a living. Like there's a guy in Reactive UI maintainer in Australia who decided to get a van, drive around Australia in a van, very minimal expenses, I can live on 15 grand a year. But I don't know about you guys, but I don't think that's, like sustainable for me. I've now moved away from the company model I've mentioned before, and now a full-time employee, but my company is quite generous, which leads me into my next point. Corporate involvement. So you can get corporations involved with open source development. So different companies are very good about this, but some aren't. So a good example where companies weren't great at this was Amazon, for example. When I worked at Amazon, their internal policy was no open source development without approvals. Their philosophy behind that is they had some projects they were committing to as a company, so some public repos for the community, and they wanted sort of like the focus to be more on the Amazon approach. But that wasn't great if you were just doing, like for me, reactive UI or something. And that's one of the reasons why I left Amazon, because, like the approval process is a bit hell. But the counter argument with Amazon was they were great for consuming open source software. So they said if there's any of these projects have these licenses, you can use those projects within your project, but you have to use a documentation tool internally, document it, and that way they can generate all the notes. But other companies like Google, Microsoft, they have much more of a friendly atmosphere. They focus more on don't develop unapproved open source development in corporate time, right? And using corporate assets, which is fair enough. But at the same time, a lot of projects at Microsoft in that spare time bracket have become well-known projects, right? So they aren't afraid to these days. Like I worked at Microsoft back in the big bad days when you try to use an open source project, the lawyers have to get involved, and the lawyer process would take 6 months. And you'd be sitting there, and then your boss would just go, we don't have time to wait 6 months. Can you just go develop yeah, sure, that open source project's great, but just go develop that project from scratch just for internal use. And even inside Microsoft, yeah, we don't really want to have to get approvals to use that project's code. We want to kind of like, just develop from scratch again. I know we've done this internally many times before. Like, yeah, sure, that ID, Visual Studio already done that ID thing, but we really need to redo that again because we don't have to deal with lawyers and corporate and all that kind of stuff. These days are a lot better, right? I use GitHub internally. Processes are a lot better. And one way a lot of companies can help out is, like getting your employees involved with open source. Like finding, like you can make it for a corporate event, right? You're using a product internally, got some bugs you need fixed. Why not get some people involved on a management layer? You can get some bugs fixes. The etiquette doing that though is not just to go off and do it. Probably jump on the issues, make a new issue, say, hey, we're happy as a company to help you out. A company I was involved with contracting for recently did that for some mocking frameworks. They got me helping out for a couple of days and fixed up the project and then got new releases out. And that's definitely a valid way to help out. And like I've had Microsoft assets come in and help out with performance, but it'd be great if companies that are using my projects to come in and say, hey, we're happy to help out. And the other thing is obviously they can participate in the sponsoring. And again, it's not necessarily just a one-way deal, right? You can sponsor and then get the, as we discussed with the sponsorship model, you can get your rewards back and get private repos and priority on issues and things like that. And you can potentially, when you're helping out projects, you can get recognition for helping out the project. So there's potentially marketing recognition. You can ask for if you're offering $20,000 or something, you can get a logo and talks when they're doing a talk about the project. You can have your company promoted that way, so it enhances your reputation as a company. So yeah, I guess those are the I guess that's sort of like the big hurdles I found. And at the moment, I'd love for the floor to be open. Maybe if anyone's got comments or even hear about what I've talked about, just to pat at the time.
Let's see, there's no questions out there at the moment, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this looks very different in other open source communities, so not .NET, but Java, JavaScript.
Yeah, JavaScript's a big one. They have they basically build into their tool sets funding. So there's a feature in the main package management called NPM Fund. It can show you projects that need funding and projects, and there's a bit more. There's some JavaScript, TypeScript projects that have got massive amount of money. It's a bit of a it's not the norm for sure, but I don't think I know of any .NET projects that have got the large funding base that the JavaScript ones. Sorry. Yeah, that's sort of like the discussion a lot of people have had recently, that maybe like the NuGet system should have a funding feature in it, right? That you can see projects that need funding. The challenge with .NET in general is I use the command line all the time, and the NPM is focused around command line a lot, right? So, but .NET has .NET package install. You can type in the command line, but there's a lot of enterprises that have ruled the .NET ecosystem for a while, and they're used to the Visual Studio. So you probably need to have Microsoft on board to, create a tab inside Visual Studio for funding, right? And I'm sure if there's enough momentum, and there's definitely people pushing for this, I'm sure that could happen, right? As well as, a funding command, like, especially if you can get like people like Martin Woodward from GitHub with the sponsors project, maybe getting communication inside the Visual Studio team and dev inside Microsoft, like getting those two teams to combine and, get that funding model across. But yeah, I've noticed also, as I mentioned, a lot of open source people in .NET have given up and just gone for the dual licensing. Like, I don't know many, like there's a lot of projects. For me, going dual license means I have to, there's a downside of going dual license. I have to now commit to supporting people, right? And this is a hobby, a part-time thing for me. I mean, initially when I got into open source development, it was because I was pretty sick. I had a cyst in the nose, and until that was taken out, I couldn't bear any sound. Like it was causing me any sound was like getting major headaches, which is a weird thing. So I was out of action for 3 months, and then had the surgery and was back to normal. But during that 3 to 6 months, you'll see my GitHub profile was complete green from all the contributions because I was bored. I wanted to do development, but I couldn't handle being like the lockdown would have been perfect for me back then. This was 2018. But like the downside of dual licenses, you now have to, commit to SLAs, right? So there's that downside as well. And in some ways, like the corporate model of having contributions remote, like from corporates, is a friendlier model in some ways, just because you're not having to commit to anything. They're helping out and putting the time in as well. But at the same time, as me, I've got an employment. I could sure I've done the company around the project, but if you're trying to make money from it and make a sustainable business around your open source project, that model I mentioned would just rely on corporate submissions to your project, code submissions, is probably not going to cut it.
So Glenn, yeah, I got a question. So when you're talking about the dual license, I guess one very familiar one for me is Duende Identity Server, and others like that, where they've got a community license and then the commercial license. So is that sort of
Yeah, that's right.
Favor in a way that you could, because it's a commercial version, you provide that support. The community one obviously is there to promote and get the thing used.
So Identity Server, I think, has gone for a similar model to 6 Labors in Australia with the image sharp library, where they have a cutoff point with funding, where they say if you get $1 million revenue, you have to buy a sponsorship. But I think also if you buy a license, you get support, right? So so both are doing that model. Like if you look at the image sharp, the 6 Labors website, you can see they've got a very fancy front end. And it's been discussion for years. Like I've spoken to people how just in the big problem is also perception in the .NET ecosystem about open source in general, right? With the, it's just it's a fly-by-wire, it's going away tomorrow. Being open source is not something you can rely on, because if you're a corporate, which is predominantly where the market's been, that's a big risk, right? So companies like 6 Labors and, like the Identity Server guys, adopting the dual license model allows that kind of like friendliness to corporates to kind of like get that buy-in and feel like, because there's a contributions going into it, it's not going to disappear tomorrow, right? So
Yeah, I know Newtonsoft did the same thing with some of their JSON stuff.
The schema,
Like the schema validation and stuff like that, requires their commercial license as opposed to just the free license.
I know that James Newton King has gone to Microsoft now, though.
Yeah.
And I think he's a gRPC, I think it is. He's a big project.
Yep.
So did that change when he swapped over to Microsoft? Does it remain?
I don't know. This was just something I was looking. I know I was working on some stuff probably 12, 18 months ago, and I needed to do schema validation. So
yeah, and that world's become complicated because Microsoft internally did system text JSON and stuff, and which one do you adopt? But that being said, that's another controversy in the Microsoft world. There's been some projects where Microsoft invited the developer along to have it, almost for employment or whatever, based on their open source project, and they were thinking that they were going to get, their project supported. Yay, Microsoft supported me. And then Microsoft made the competing product internally. That happened about 12 months ago. That caused a little bit of controversy. It's definitely, like, if you, probably the corporates don't experience it, but definitely in the community, there's a little bit of controversy-friendly environment. And I've definitely caused my share of those, but generally when I've tried to do it, I try to focus, here's a problem, here's how we can solve it. So, we had a big problem we had with the .NET Foundation about 2 years ago is silently behind anyone's knowledge, all the GitHub repos for all the member projects, even they weren't Microsoft owned, they suddenly became owned by the GitHub enterprise server for the Microsoft, for the .NET Foundation GitHub, and suddenly a lot of your sponsor features stopped working. So, like people rely on sponsorships. Suddenly it was ambiguous which entity was eligible for the sponsors. So that was a big controversy that happened about 12 months ago. So there's a big focus inside the .NET Foundation now around kind of like introducing more transparency. And part of that, like when we had the mock scenario come up, mock is not a .NET Foundation project. They're free to do whatever we want. And we, they had, obviously struggles with getting funding, but, like internally, the big thing I wanted to do was to make a privacy guide, for example, that we could allow, member projects to, hey, this is what you can do with the European laws, this is what you can do with Australian laws, here's some good practices you want to do. But the conclusion in the foundation meeting was, with the board members, was this is going to cost us a lot of money in legal. So I had to back down on that one. But now I'm kind of like, my goal is to make some general guides for member projects and also the larger community about how to sustain your project, and maybe just some general advice around that privacy thing, like probably don't collect emails and don't do those things unless you've got a good lawyer, basically, and a good policy.
I've got a question.
Yep.
It's more broadly about contributing to open source.
Sure.
I like that idea for some of the reasons that you mentioned, like personal growth and that kind of thing. Outside of the obvious, like, I'm working on a project using some package. It's not doing what I want. Okay, I can contribute that way, maybe fix a bug. Is there any way outside of that to maybe find some project that you can contribute to, or any tips for that?
So the question is, how can you find things to contribute to open source projects? Just because I don't know if you've got a microphone or if you can pick it up. So a lot of projects, part of the .NET Foundation is a contributor guide. It's part of our induction guide. And a lot of projects, I will personally, I haven't been very good at it lately, but a lot of projects will go through and say newbie friendly on a lot of existing issues, and we'll go in, especially around October, like the October Code Fest. We'll go in and say either mark it Oktoberfest or we'll mark it with newbie friendly. But like generally also just going through the issues and finding one that you're kind of interested in, just putting your name down. Etiquette, generally, I've had people get upset that we haven't taken their PR, so pull requests, like taking their code in, because it doesn't really fit with, like every maintainer will feel guilty when someone's put in hours and hours of contribution and it just doesn't quite fit with the model. So you can save yourself a bunch of time just by saying, here's what I'm thinking of doing. Are you happy for me to give it a go? And also most projects will have a chat community so you can jump on and sort of like discuss with the maintainers. The other one is don't, like I've had people argue with you, like for example, we had one where the .NET 7 makes it a little bit harder to get all the code fixes for WPF and stuff, and we have to deliberately keep the SDK version in the target framework in the CS proj file very natural version. And this guy wanted to simplify it, and we kept saying the reasons why we simplified it. Downstream dependencies needed that, and he would just argue and argue. I've had that many times throughout the years, being respectful, kind of. But I would say the respect should go both ways. Like I've had times where I've just had the fifth person do that to me, and I overreacted. Right? People should be respectful back, and but generally, if you're polite and you kind of give a bit of a, hey, here's my kind of like approach to fixing the issue, people are usually, in my experience, they won't, they'll say, I don't like the aspect. How do you feel about this? I remember when I used to work at Microsoft, and I generally employ this in open source too. We used to have psychology classes for our code reviews, because people got so aggressive during the code reviews and people were getting upset. So we had psychologists coming in, and one of the big philosophies was don't use the word "you" in your pull request review, because, and same with like your tech specs and stuff, because you can be misconstrued a lot, because you did this, why did you do this? Well, if you say, I prefer this approach, what do you think? Getting rid of the word you out of the sentence gets a lot of aggressiveness out of the context of the review.
Or the word just.
Yeah. Just is another good one, yeah. So, yeah. But, like, I would say 90% of people would definitely welcome but yeah, if they don't have newbie friendly, if you get on the chat community and most people, hey, I'm interested in some, contributing, how can I help out? That's definitely a good way to go.
Got a very interesting question for Glenn. Why do you think GitHub's open source story is so much more successful than the Azure DevOps open source? Because you can have public repos, public projects on Azure DevOps as well. Why do you think GitHub is just so much more popular?
I would say a big part is the authentication model. It's much simpler. It's a much more simple UI. Everything's integrated in one place. In Azure, things are like 6 different places. GitHub was already like, I would say performance is another one. GitHub is a very different backend process. Just looks a lot cleaner. I would say DevOps is still probably dominating in terms of people tend to use DevOps as a CI server a lot still. Like I'd say, because it's got a much more mature plugin system, I would say GitHub Actions has a smarter contribution model because it's just basing it off the repos. But I would say it took a while to get all those repos available. But then again, you've got the same trust issue with like whenever I go looking for a GitHub GitHub action, right, and I'm going to the marketplace, like I have to do a lot of evaluation around that project. The things that the .NET Foundation already do for .NET projects for you, right? Where they look at the number of downloads, they look at the reputation, they look at how easily you'll get issues, how mature your contribution guide is, how mature you are with the security processes and all that sort of stuff. But I have to do that work. I don't know of any foundation doing that work for you with GitHub Actions. While with DevOps stuff, all the actions are a lot more mature, right? So, but I would say with regards to code and things like that, I would say that GitHub was a lot more mature with a lot of the, the ability to get a README file in here easily, and then DevOps was on the back foot on that. And like configuring the permission set in DevOps is a absolute nightmare, right? Like the big problem I had with DevOps is logging in for a while, like because I had shared credentials on the same email, I was having to jump between this multi-tenant, this multi-tenant, this multi-tenant, and I have to scrub my cookies half the time to get it to be able to log in. Like I had .NET Foundation credentials for the DevOps server. I had personal credentials, and I had my employer using my email address as my credentials, and I was just going through hell. Like definitely Firefox containers, and Edge has those now. And
funny you say that. I found a while ago a URL that I don't know how it popped up, but it's just aex.dev.azure.com, which actually lets you select which tenant you want to go into.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more. You don't have to scrap your cookies anymore.
Yeah.
That just seems to work really nicely. I use it every other day.
But yeah, the authentication model with GitHub is just one email, and then you use the get granted permissions for the project. And their permission model is a lot easier to understand. You got maintainer, you got like triage, you got read write, and you got admin, right? It's the default, and then you can do custom stuff. I would say GitHub Actions again has sort of like they're like some of the features that haven't traditionally existed are like gating, like being able to say, let me select when I'm going to release it to the world. That stuff didn't exist until more recently, but they've named it weirdly in GitHub, right? And GitHub Actions lands on an environment.
Yeah.
It's not called a, like a release gate, or I can't remember what it's called in DevOps, but
Stage,
like,
I think.
yeah. So there's differences in terminology and stuff. And also in DevOps land for a while, and still quite popular, is they've got a GUI drag and drop action developer, right? You can drag and drop actions in. Well, with GitHub, it's still the YAML, but YAML's superior probably. But it adds an extra layer of learning on top of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
But the other thing I like about GitHub recently is their code spaces stuff. You can create a code space per PR, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that stuff's pretty cool. We use a fair bit of that now. Yeah. Is there any other questions online, Bill?
No, but I will go ahead and plug the Azure Nights talk later on in this month, because it's some of the GitHub code spaces and things like that. So have a look at that meetup, because I know that's one of the interests I have, because I'm a diehard Azure DevOps person moving to GitHub. So yes, prying it from my dying hands, but yeah, the code spaces and things like that are going to be covered in that Azure Nights talk later in September. So we just want to say thanks everyone for attending, and I think that's pretty much going to be the end. Did you want?
No, it's pretty.
Okay.
Thanks,
So there wasn't any question. Thanks very much, Glenn. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast now. Thank you.
Maybe can we bring